Imagine standing at the very top of the world. Not metaphorically, literally. The lights are blinding and beautiful. 50,000 people are screaming your name. You have just done something no one thought was humanly possible. And the crowd is so loud you can feel the vibration in your chest, in your teeth, in your bones. You are 22 years old, and you have already won everything there is to win. You are the most electric, most joyful, most alive human being in any room you have ever entered. Now imagine that at 32 years old, in a press conference so quiet you could hear a single person sobbing in the back row. You have to tell the entire world something that you yourself just found out. Something that, in 1991, felt less like a diagnosis and more like a death sentence delivered in slow motion. And then imagine that the thing that almost destroyed you, the thing whispered about in shame, the thing that made strangers afraid to shake your hand, becomes the very foundation on which you build an empire. That smile, that is where we have to begin. Because for anyone who ever watched Irvin Johnson Jr. play basketball, the smile is the first thing you remember, not the passes. And there has never been anyone on earth who passed a basketball like he did. Not the championships, not the highlights. The smile. It arrived before he even touched the ball. It was already there when he jogged onto the court, huge and genuine and slightly conspiratorial. Like he in the game of basketball had a private joke the rest of us were only just beginning to understand. That smile was real. It was always real. But real things can coexist with real pain. And the story of Magic Johnson, the full story, not the trophy case version, is a story about how much a human being can hold at once. Irvin Johnson Jr. was born on August 14, 1959, in Lansing, Michigan, and Lansing in those years was a city that asked hard things of the people who lived there. It was a working city, a factory city, built on the labor of hands rather than the ambitions of capital. His father, Irvin Sr., worked the line at General Motors, sometimes pulling double shifts that started before the sun came up and ended long after it had set. His mother, Christine, cleaned other people's houses to bring in the difference. They were not poor in the way that breaks a family apart. They were poor in the way that quietly, stubbornly, holds a family together. There were 10 children in that house on Middle Street. 10 children, 2 parents, and 1 bathroom. You learn a lot about sharing when you grow up like that. You learn a lot about waiting. You learn that warmth is something you generate from the inside, because the outside cannot always be counted on to provide it. Young Irvin, nobody called him Magic yet, that was still years away, fell in love with basketball the way some children fall in love with language or music, the way certain people are simply built for one specific thing in the universe, in its occasional generosity, places that thing directly in their path early enough to matter. He was on the court before school. He was on the court after school. He was on the court in the dark when the street lights were the only lights left. His mother would call him in for dinner, and he would take just a few more shots, always just a few more, because the ball leaving his hands and finding the basket felt like the only conversation he knew how to have completely fluently. By the time he got to Everett High School, people were already paying attention in the specific, hungry way that people pay attention when they sense they are watching something they will want to remember. A local sports writer named Fred Stabley Jr. gave him the name Magic after watching him score 36 points, grab 18 rebounds, and dish out 16 assists in a single game. Stabley said afterward that he had simply run out of ordinary words. Magic was not a nickname. It was an acknowledgement. It was Lansing, Michigan's way of saying, we know what we are looking at, even if we cannot quite explain it. But here is the thing nobody talks about when they tell the Magic Johnson story. Here is the part that gets skipped over in the highlight reels and the ESPN retrospectives. The pressure on that teenager was immense in a way that had nothing to do with basketball. Irvin Sr. had sacrificed years of his life at that factory, so his children would have choices he never had. Christine had bent her back cleaning other people's floors so her son could stand upright on a court of his own. Every dribble, every pass, every smile for the cameras. All of it carried the weight of two people who had given everything and asked, in the quietest possible way, that it not be wasted. That is not a small thing to carry. That is not something you put down at halftime. He chose Michigan State over every other school in the country. He chose to stay close to home, close to Lansing, close to the family that had made him. And in 1979, in Salt Lake City, Utah, at the NCAA championship game, he faced a player named Larry Bird from Indiana State. And the two of them produced a game so compelling, so suffused with competitive electricity, that it became the moment college basketball stopped being a regional conversation and became a national obsession. Michigan State won. Magic Johnson, 19 years old, was named the most outstanding player. He was laughing when they put the trophy in his hands. Of course he was laughing. The smile was already there, already doing what it always did, telling everyone in the building that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Los Angeles Lakers took him first overall in the 1979 NBA draft, and if Lansing had felt like home, Los Angeles felt like a different planet entirely. The heat was different. The light was different. The Forum, where the Lakers played, was a cathedral of purple and gold and cigarette smoke and Hollywood money. And in the middle of all of it was this 20-year-old kid from Michigan who still called his mother every Sunday. The culture shock was real. The loneliness, in those first months, was also real, though he would not admit it to anyone for years. He was surrounded by people, always surrounded by people, and yet there were nights in that Los Angeles apartment when the city felt impossibly large, and he felt impossibly small inside it. But then the game would start, and nothing else existed. In his very first NBA season, the Lakers lost Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, their center, their anchor, the most dominant player of his generation, to an ankle injury in Game 5 of the NBA Finals. Game 6 was in Philadelphia. The Lakers were expected to lose. Magic Johnson, a rookie point guard, started at center. He played all 5 positions that night. He scored 42 points. He grabbed 15 rebounds. He dished 7 assists. The Lakers won. Magic was named Finals MVP. He was 20 years old. He called his father from the locker room, and Irvin Sr., a man who had worked 30 years on a factory floor without ever once crying about it, could not speak for a long time. The 1980s in Los Angeles belonged to the Showtime Lakers the way a song belongs to the summer it was released, completely, joyfully, in a way that makes it impossible to think of one without the other. 5 championships. Magic Johnson named Finals MVP 3 times. A rivalry with Larry Bird that transcended sports and became something closer to mythology. The two of them pushed each other in ways that neither fully understood at the time, and together they saved a league that had been struggling for its identity. They were opposites in almost every visible way. Bird, white and from French Lick, Indiana, quietly furious, fundamentally suspicious of anything that felt like showmanship. Magic, black and from Lansing, radiantly joyful, constitutionally incapable of doing anything without making it beautiful to watch. And yet they respected each other with the kind of depth that only comes from genuine understanding. From knowing, in your bones, that the person across from you is the only one who truly sees what you are doing. Magic had his first MVP award in 1987, his second in 1989, his third in 1990. The Forum was always sold out. Jack Nicholson sat courtside. The city of Los Angeles wore the Lakers the way a person wears their best clothes, as an expression of something they want the world to know about them. And then came November 7th, 1991. The press conference was held in Inglewood, California, at the Great Western Forum. Magic Johnson walked out in a blue suit, and the room, packed with journalists, with cameras, with people who thought they were covering a routine media event, went very, very quiet when they saw his face. He was 32 years old. He stood at the microphone and he told the world that he had tested positive for HIV and that, because of this, he was retiring from professional basketball, effective immediately. The word HIV, in 1991, was not just a medical term. It carried with it an entire architecture of fear and misunderstanding and prejudice that had been building since the early 1980s. People were dying from AIDS in hospital rooms while their families were told not to touch them. Blood banks were refusing donations. There were politicians arguing, in public, that infected individuals should be quarantined. The stigma was not background noise. It was the loudest thing in the room. And here was Magic Johnson, the most famous athlete on the planet, the brightest smile in American sports, telling a stunned and tearful press conference that the virus was inside him. He held his wife Cookie's hand throughout. She was pregnant with their son, EJ, who would be born the following June. Cookie had also been tested immediately and was negative. Magic spoke about it calmly, or as calmly as a person can speak about the thing that has just rearranged every assumption they had about their own future. He said he would now become a spokesperson for HIV awareness. He said he wanted to help people understand that this virus did not discriminate. He said he was going to be fine. The world did not entirely believe him, because in 1991, people with HIV were not usually fine. What followed was a period of time that Magic Johnson has only gradually, and with considerable private cost, begun to describe in full. There were the friends who stopped calling. There were the whispers about how he had contracted the virus, whispers that were cruel and reductive and often wrong. There were the teammates who hesitated, briefly but visibly, at the idea of sharing a court with him. When he was selected for the 1992 Olympic Dream Team, and then again tried to come back to the NBA, certain players expressed, through their unions and their representatives, that they were concerned about playing against him. The implication was that basketball, contact sport, minor cuts and scrapes, and the ordinary collisions of men competing, could transmit what he carried. The science said otherwise. The fear said its own thing, louder. Magic Johnson handled all of this in a way that, looking back, seems almost impossible. He smiled. He showed up. He participated in the Dream Team in Barcelona and played some of the most joyful basketball of his career alongside Michael Jordan and Larry Bird and Charles Barkley. Because if you are Magic Johnson and there is a basketball court and people to play with, you play. The Dream Team won gold. Magic scored 13 points in the gold medal game and smiled through all of it. This enormous, slightly heartbroken smile that contained everything he was not saying in public. He came back to the Lakers briefly in 1992, then retired again. He tried once more in 1995. By then, the HIV medications that would eventually transform the disease from a death sentence into a manageable condition were beginning to emerge. Magic Johnson was, in the most literal possible sense, at the forefront of the generation that lived long enough to benefit from them. He followed the medical protocols with a discipline that bordered on obsessive because he had understood, from the moment of his diagnosis, that his survival was going to require active, daily, unrelenting participation. This was not passive hope. This was work. But the cost of those years, the emotional cost, the psychological cost, is not something that shows up in the box scores or the business headlines that would come later. Cookie Johnson, in interviews she gave many years afterward, described a husband who sometimes woke in the middle of the night silent and unreachable, who carried a heaviness that the public version of him never showed, who sat with his son EJ when EJ was a baby and thought about things that no father should have to think about time, about presence, about what it means to promise something to a child when you cannot be certain of your own future. E.J. Johnson would come out publicly as gay in 2013. Magic Johnson's response to this, in interviews and in the way he has spoken about his son ever since, has been one of the most quietly moving things about his public life. He said he loved his son completely. He said he had always known and had always loved what he knew. He said a man's job, when his child comes to him with their truest self, is to hold that self gently and without condition. This was not a man performing acceptance for a camera. This was a man who had spent years understanding what it costs to be misunderstood and who had decided somewhere in that process, that he would not pass that cost on. The business life of Magic Johnson is, by any measure, extraordinary. Starting in the mid-1990s, he began investing in underserved communities, specifically in the idea that Black neighborhoods in American cities deserve the same quality retail and entertainment infrastructure that wealthy white neighborhoods took for granted. He opened a Starbucks in Crenshaw. He opened movie theaters in Harlem and Atlanta and inner-city neighborhoods across the country. He built a business empire called Magic Johnson Enterprises that, by the mid-2010s, was valued at over $1 billion. He became part of the ownership group that purchased the Los Angeles Dodgers in 2012 for $2 billion, the largest transaction in professional sports history at the time. And he did all of this not from some gleaming office tower in Manhattan, but from a philosophy he had formed in Lansing, Michigan, when he was a child watching his parents work themselves toward exhaustion so that something better might be possible. He believed that capital follows attention, that investment follows belief, and that no community in America was fundamentally unworthy of either. He put his money where his belief was. He hired from the communities he invested in. He built where other people saw only risk. There are those who have criticized aspects of the Magic Johnson business story, who have raised questions about the terms of certain deals, about the tensions between profit and community benefit that exist in any commercial enterprise operating in vulnerable neighborhoods. These are legitimate conversations. Magic Johnson is not a saint. He is a man who built a business, and businesses are complicated moral structures. But the fact remains that he went back, that he chose, at every turn, to face the communities his parents had come from, rather than turning away from them once the money arrived. At 66 years old, Magic Johnson is still smiling. You see him on television and the smile is there, the same one it always was, the one that arrived before any of the trophies and has outlasted all of the crises. But if you really look, you can see something behind it now that was not there when he was 22 and invincible at the Forum. It is not sadness exactly. It is something more complex than sadness. It is the expression of a man who has stood inside the worst room and found the door, who has watched the world misunderstand him and kept showing up anyway, who has looked at his son and understood that love, real love, does not arrive with conditions attached. His HIV status has been described by his doctors as undetectable for years. The medications work. The discipline works. He is, in the most precise medical sense, a man who has been living with HIV for over 3 decades and is healthy. This is a miracle, but not a random one. It is the kind of miracle that requires 30 years of daily participation to achieve. 30 years of pills and appointments and blood tests and the quiet, unglamorous work of refusing to be defined by a diagnosis while simultaneously never pretending it is not there. And yet there is a grief inside this story that does not resolve neatly, because grief rarely does. There is the grief of the years he spent wondering, the grief of the friendships that ended with a diagnosis, the grief of knowing that thousands of people who received the same news in the same year did not survive long enough to see what the medications would eventually make possible. Magic Johnson has spoken about this, about survivor's guilt, about the weight of having been lucky enough to have resources that most people did not have, about the moral obligation that comes with that particular luck. He has spoken about it carefully, because he is a careful man when it comes to the things that truly matter. But the weight is there. You can see it in the moments between the smiles. Now here is where I want to speak directly to you. Not to Magic Johnson, who does not need my words, but to you. Whoever you are, wherever you are watching this, whatever you have brought with you into this moment. There is a version of this story that ends with the trophies, the 5 championships, the 3 MVPs, the Olympic gold medal, the billion-dollar business. Those things are real, and they matter. But they are not the whole story, and I think you already knew that, which is why you are still here. You are still here because you sensed, from the first few minutes, that the real story was something harder and more honest and more worth your time than a highlight reel. Here is what I think Magic Johnson's life actually teaches, if you are willing to sit with it long enough to hear it. He received news at 32 years old that would have ended most people, not necessarily ended their physical lives, but ended their willingness to remain visible, to remain joyful, to remain useful to the world. He stood at that microphone and he chose to be seen anyway, not because he was fearless. I promise you he was not fearless, but because he understood that visibility, in that particular moment, was an act of service. That if he disappeared, the shame would deepen. That if he stayed, something else might become possible. He stayed. He built. He loved his son without conditions. He invested in communities that had been told they were not worth investing in. He took the virus that the world handed him like a punishment, and he carried it for 30 years without letting it become the only thing he carried. That smile, the one from the beginning of this story, the one you have seen 1,000 times in 1,000 different photographs, it is not a performance. It is not a mask. It is the face of a man who has made a decision again and again, every single day, to find the part of the day that is still worth smiling about. Even in the years when that part was very small. Even in the nights when it was almost invisible. What is the thing in your life that you have been told defines you? What is the diagnosis, the failure, the mistake, the moment you cannot stop replaying? What is the version of yourself that the world decided was the true one, the fixed one, the one you were not allowed to expand beyond? Because Magic Johnson, at 66 years old, is still expanding, still investing, still showing up, still holding Cookie's hand, still cheering for EJ in a way that fills every room he walks into, still carrying that forum, that purple and gold forum where he first learned what it meant to be fully, completely, luminously alive, not as a place he left behind, but as something he has carried forward into every room and every decision since. The question is not what tragedy has handed you. The question, and I mean this genuinely, and I want you to sit with it after this video ends, is what you are choosing to build with what remains.